Hey, welcome back to the Gentleman Grinchowski Show. My guest today is a author, voiceover man, done everything in Hollywood, knows everybody, met everybody, a great man to talk to. If you want to know anything about Hollywood, this is especially classic Hollywood, this is definitely the man to talk to, Steve Stoller. And the Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside of Groucho Marx's House, was a book that is soon to be turned into a movie. And he
Yes.
also was a co-author of The Imperfect Storm, from Henry Street to Hollywood, and this is a memoir of famed comedian and director Howard Storm. Can you tell us about your time with Howard Storm and you
Howard,
know?
sure. Howard's a great guy. We got to be friends over the last several years, and he has so many stories. He has a reputation amongst Hollywood people of being a great storyteller. And people have said, Howard, you've got to write these stories down. These are too good, and people would like it. And he said, I know myself. I know I'm never going to have the discipline to write this by myself. And he asked me if I would be interested in writing it with him. So it was this remarkable journey. He grew up on the Lower East Side of New York in the Depression, and his father was in vaudeville and in burlesque as a comic. And his father hung out with all of these mobsters on the Lower East Side of New York. I mean, he knew Louis Lepke and Buchalter and Murder Incorporated. A cousin or an uncle of Howard's was rubbed out by the mob. Just all these, and then growing up, Howard, there was another generation of hoodlums that he hung out with, and he's got so many stories that just sound like the closest imaginable call to being beaten to death or shot to death or something. And then he realized that he had a flair for comedy, so he became a stand-up, and he worked in all of these mobbed up clubs along the East Coast, and has all these stories about fist fights while he's trying to do his show. He said he was playing one club, and while he's at the microphone, this guy went running behind him across the stage and out the exit, followed by another man firing a gun at him. So Howard ran off the stage and into the kitchen where the club owner was. The club owner said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "There's a guy on the stage firing a gun." And the owner said, "Was he shooting at you?" And Howard said, "No." He said, "Well, then get back up there and finish it." And Howard had to go back up with his dry lips and shaky hands holding onto the mic stand and finish his gig. But then he started getting better gigs like the Copacabana in New York. But as the cliche goes, what he really wanted to do was direct. And he ended up directing Rhoda and the Bob Newhart Show, and every episode of the first 3 years of Mork and Mindy. So he had a front row seat to Robin Williams' brilliance and also his personal demons. So there's a lot of interesting insight about Robin Williams and Pam Dauber and what it was like. Robin Williams, his idol was Jonathan Winters. They both did crazy improvisational off the ball things. And Howard was able to observe what it was like when Winters guest starred on the show to see their different styles and how they meshed and how they clashed. And so we put it together, and it's The Imperfect Storm from Henry Street to Hollywood. And Henry Street was that rough area that looking at the picture of Groucho, and I'm mixing up my that Howard grew up. And he's just a great guy, and that's available on Amazon in Kindle or book format, and people seem to like it. Dick Cavett wrote the introduction, and Woody Allen gave us a great blurb, and then even after that, we had sent him the manuscript, and he loved it. And once we got copies of the actual published book, Howard and I signed a copy and I sent it to Woody, and he wrote back and he said, I really look forward to reading it all over again because it's so damn entertaining. You two guys really aced this one. And it was so great reading that because it was completely unsolicited, had nothing to do with the blurb on the book. It was just that he wanted to read it again because it was so good. So that was really gratifying.
Now, how did you get to meet Woody Allen?
I got to meet Woody Allen through Dick Cavett, who had been his friend since the very early 60s when they were both stand-ups in Greenwich Village. I had been wary of wanting to meet him because, especially after Stardust Memories, I thought he doesn't suffer fools gladly and doesn't seem to suffer fans gladly. And maybe he's best observed from a distance. So when I moved to New York to write for Cavett, he would say, you know, Woody and I are going to take a walk in Central Park tomorrow, and I never said, hey, can I meet him? Woody was aware of who I was because Cavett would show him letters that I wrote in my Groucho. You know, when something happened at Groucho's, I would zip a piece of paper into the typewriter and send it off. And Cavett told me that he showed them to Woody Allen, who said they're well written. So he knew who I was. And then one day, Dick Cavett called me and said, I just noticed that Woody is shooting his new film around the corner from my apartment. So I thought you could wander over here and we could just happen on them and then you could meet him. And I said, and he won't mind? And he said, oh, I didn't say that. He may very well say, really, Dickie, I wish you hadn't. So it's like, oh, great. I'm nervous about meeting him. And now you tell me he may be against it. But we went over and it was, he was filming Hannah and Her Sisters. And I got to meet him and Mia Farrow. And it was remarkable because it was so unremarkable. The four of us just were conversing about this and that. And I thought, wow, I'm standing here talking to Dick Cavett and Mia Farrow and Woody Allen. And then when I moved back to LA in '85, because my writing assignments had dried up in New York and I was offered a job on a short-lived action adventure show out here. So I had reluctantly left Manhattan for LA again. Woody and I started up a correspondence. He still types on the Olympia portable manual typewriter he got in high school. So it gets the clogged letters and flying caps and Xing out things. A friend of mine looked at one of the letters and said, what software is this? And I said, Larry, it's a typewriter. He said, I know, but they make software that looks like old typewriters. I said, no, that's not. And he still hates to change the ribbon after 60 years. He hates it, but he's been very supportive. We could do a whole other show about the terrible injustice that has been done to him by Miss Farrow. It looks like the pendulum might be starting to swing back towards sanity, but it's very unfortunate that he's been the victim of her slanderous child molestation charges because there isn't anything to them, as the evidence and any number of child abuse experts show. But he just keeps rolling along. I admire his intrepidness. I mean, he's in his 80s now. He's still directing. He's still writing. He's very content. He's been married to Soon Yi. She's nearly 50. They're very happy. They have 2 adopted daughters. And of course, they would never have been allowed to adopt little girls if there was any hint that they'd be at peril. So I get hopping mad when I read stuff about him, and he just lets it roll off him somehow. He's able to compartmentalize. So he's actually quite happy, and it's very cool that I got some pictures of the 2 of us on the set of Cafe Society a few years ago. He said, feel free to come by the set and watch how not to make a movie. So I got to hang out with him on the set, and that was that was its own remarkable story.
Yeah, definitely. And the good thing about that, as long as he's comfortable, he doesn't care what other people think about him. That's what matters. That's how everyone should be in life. Everyone's always too worried about, someone doesn't say thinks this about me. Who cares? If you're comfortable with everything,
Well,
what's up.
he said his ace in the hole is knowing he's innocent. And I thought, for me, that wouldn't be the ace in the hole. That would be the worst part, because it would be like a nightmare, where I would want to stop people on the street and say, the things you're hearing about me aren't true. I need to explain to you what's behind all this stuff. But because in his heart and mind, he knows that it didn't happen, he finds solace in that and just accepts the fact that a certain chunk of the public will always think he's a monster, and there is no unringing that bell for them, So he's always just been a real mensch, very supportive of my work, and he gave me a blurb for Raised Eyebrows, said it was one of the best books about a show business icon he'd ever read, which blew me away. So yeah, he's a cool guy.
Yeah, sounds like it to me. Now, can you tell us about working with Dick Cavett?
That was great, because we were friends. We were friends from the Groucho days, from corresponding. And then he was working at HBO, and he was going to have a show called HBO Magazine, which was sort of a guide to what was coming up that month on HBO. And it would have interviews with some of the people, comedians and music acts. And they needed someone to write the things he said. And he suggested me. So I went from being a production secretary at Universal. I left LAX, a secretary, and touched down at JFK, this writer from California that Dick Cavett has hired. It was great. We had so many adventures in the 2.5 years I lived in New York. I was able to key into his sense of humor and style. The very first thing I wrote for him was, before I moved to New York, he came out to LA to guest host The Tonight Show during one of those times when Carson was on vacation. And he said, why don't you write some monologue material for me? And I thought, I don't know how to do that. There's professionals that do that. But I accepted the challenge and got a legal pad and a pen and laid down on my couch and started thinking about, well, what's happening in the world today and what's going on. And I jotted down some jokes, and the courier from NBC picked them up. And then I got to go there and watch that. Oh God, my palms were sweating, because it was like me out there on stage when he walked out and started saying jokes that I had written for him. And they actually got a really solid response from the audience. And on the way back to his dressing room, he said, you saved my ass with that monologue. And I told someone that in his company years later, and he said, is that what you thought I said, you shaved my ass with that monologue. So there isn't enough silliness in the world today. Everybody's too uptight. I like silliness. Alan likes silliness,
Yeah, nothing's wrong with that. Now, you crossed over, and when you did the monologue, you crossed over doing something you were unfamiliar with. But you know what? Dick Cavett had enough faith in your writing material. He had enough faith in you, and you knew him, that he trusted you to do something that was really, the whole country would be watching it, because the Tonight Show was the biggest thing out there. Everyone took time to watch the Tonight Show.
Yeah, he had faith in me that I didn't have, which is a frequent occurrence in my life, where I'm always underselling myself, under-promoting myself, underestimating it. And I think it's this fear that a lot of creative types have, that at some point there's going to be a hand clasping your shoulder saying, excuse me, we've made a terrible mistake, that you don't belong here. But I understand that that's really common. Someone told me a story about an amateur lyricist, and he gave someone some of his lyrics, and the guy actually sent them to Oscar Hammerstein of Rodgers and Hammerstein. And Hammerstein called up this guy and said, I have some of your lyrics in front of me, and they're very well written. And after the guy hung up, he turned to his friend and said, how do you like that? I even fooled Oscar Hammerstein. So yeah, insecurities. But yes, Cavett believed in me, and he's always been kind of a big brother, but not in the Orwellian sense.
I gotcha. We're sitting here with author Steve Stoller, and we'll be back after this. Don't go away. Hey, welcome back to the Gentleman Grachowski Show. I got Steve Stoller here. Steve Stoller also does voiceovers, and he did Frosty Returns, The Oz Kids, and Snoopy's Reunion. Steve, talk about voiceover work, because that's something that people don't realize is just as important as being in front of the camera, talking, remembering lines, you know?
Right. And you don't have to look your best. A lot of people record people record stuff in their bathrobes or whatever, because it doesn't matter, because you're not going to be seen. But yeah, I've been fortunate that I've been hired to do some stuff for Bill Melendez Productions, who did all the Charlie Brown specials going back to Charlie Brown Christmas. He was a great guy. Again, you know, one of the things I found at Groucho's was the people who were legends, who'd been around forever, were the most down to earth and personable and approachable, and the ones that had only recently become successful were the ones that might have a little bit of an attitude. And Bill Melendez was great, because he went back to Disney and Warner Brothers before he started his own studio, and worked on, you know, Bugs Bunny and just all these great things. And he was also the voice of Snoopy in the cartoons. So I did several Charlie Brown things, and also did Frosty Returns, which I was hoping at the time, because it was going to be the sequel to Frosty the Snowman, the original special from the 60s. They were going to do a sequel to it, and I was thinking, oh good, maybe this will become a holiday perennial, and every year after they show Frosty the Snowman, they'll show Frosty Returns. And sure enough, they do. And it's really cool to see that this thing keeps living on and on. It's nice to get the residual after that. But more than that, now it's part of holiday specials that people watch. And I did several voices, none of the major ones, because for the major characters on that, there was John Goodman and Brian Doyle Murray and Jan Hooks and Andrea Martin. And then a little girl, like 8 or 9 years old, played the star little girl that becomes friends with Frosty. And it was only years later I realized that was Elizabeth Moss as a kid, who later was in Handmaid's Tale and Mad Men, and now she's a big star. But at the time, she was just this little girl playing a little girl. And, you know, it didn't mean anything to me at the time, but it was really cool hanging out with John Goodman and the other guys. So,
and
yeah,
what was John Goodman like?
Huh?
What was John Goodman like?
He again was very approachable. You know, I had wondered if people mistook him for, I'm blanking on his name now. The heavyset guy from Cheers.
George Wendt.
George Wendt, yes. So I said, yes. I said, do people ever stop you and tell them how much they enjoy you on Cheers? And he said, yes. Last week, I was driving and I got to a red light, and a guy rolled his window down and said, hey, love your show, man. And I said, thanks. And then he said, but you got to tell that psychiatrist dude, he got to get his act together. And then he drove off. So yes, as I suspected, people mixed and matched. But I had recently gotten married, and my wife loved New Orleans music. So some of the music that was played at our wedding was recordings of the Neville Brothers. And Goodman said the Neville Brothers played at his wedding too, but they were there live. Also, he was from St. Louis, and we both talked about watching Captain Eleven's Showboat when we were kids, a kid show that I was actually on with my shirt untucked, which I remember him telling me I should have tucked in my shirt. So yeah, he was cool. So it's an interesting, I'd like to do more of it.
Well, yeah, and how do you prepare your voice wise? And you just go around just coming up with different voices?
Well, you have to talk, you have to find out what kind of voice they're looking for. And there's often a lot of leeway about, well, how do you think this character would sound? Or here's what he looks like. How do you think a character like that would look? Because they record the soundtrack before they animate the footage. Although they know what the characters will look like, so you can look at sketches. Although there was one time that I had to do it in reverse because you're in the Super Bowl, Charlie Brown. They put the show together and it had been written by Charles Schulz. And the show was short. And in addition to that, there were these two lengthy football sequences with all these little Woodstock birds kicking the ball and scoring. And all there was music. And they realized this doesn't make any sense to people. So a friend of mine who worked at Bill Melendez Productions called me up and said, can you write enough narration as a sportscaster to cover this and explain what's going on? So that was difficult because I had to sit there with a stopwatch and a VHS tape on my living room floor, trying to time how long each chunk was, and then practice saying, well, it's another cold day here for the football league, the Animal Football League. But I was able to record that at the studio, and I have the distinction of sharing a writing credit with Charles Schulz, which nobody else had done up to that point.
You produced a documentary on Shemp Howard. Can you tell us about that?
I did, yeah. I was working at a small production company, and we would put out pop documentaries on pop culture figures. And we did one on Shemp. And what was interesting was I got to meet and interview Shemp's daughter-in-law, the woman who married Shemp's son. So she knew him for quite a few years, and also Shemp's granddaughter. And I remember two of the things they told me was that Shemp taught them how they did the eye poke, which was to go right over the eyes, right at that hard brow ridge. You do it really fast, and you got to know what you're doing. It's what led to the whole kids don't try this at home, we're professional. But that was how it was done. It was right above the eye. And she also said, Shemp taught me how to butter an ear of corn so that you didn't end up with the pat sliding off the kernels onto the plate. He would get a piece of bread and he would butter the bread and then pick up the corn on the cob and roll the bread around up and down on it. And that way it evenly distributed the butter, but didn't get any on your lap or on your plate. So I passed these two wise tips on to your listeners and viewers on how to do the eye poke and how to butter corn without making a mess from Mr. Shemp Howard, ladies and gentlemen.
Had I known that, I gave up eating corn years ago, only for that reason. I was never satisfied with a good ear of corn, because it was just never happy the way it was buttered. Now I know the correct way to butter an ear of corn.
And then you end up with a great piece of bread with butter that tastes a little like corn, which there are worse things in life. So a
little bit of a cornmeal aftertaste, but that's okay, I think, right?
Yeah. What the heck?
Now, what's interesting is people think all these Hollywood stars of yesterday, they retired millionaires and they were so rich and famous, A lot of times that the companies that controlled the actors, they had took all their money. They were right. Most of these stars from the the golden years of Hollywood, they didn't get rewarded as stars do today.
Well, there wasn't any such thing as residuals until the 1960s. So all of the stars from the silent era and the 30s and 40s and 50s didn't get any of the money once television hit. And so that has changed. And they, a lot of them just thought that the fountain of money would never turn off. So they lived lavishly and ended up, in some cases, living very modestly or poorly. I mean, Buster Keaton he lived in the San Fernando Valley and wasn't, he did commercials and candid camera and a few things. He was able to taste some of the appreciation for his early work towards the end when there would be film festivals in Europe and they rediscovered his films. But he died in the mid 60s, really before that whole renaissance of interest in the classic comedians. Stan Laurel lived in an apartment in Santa Monica. His name was in the phone book.
All right, Steve Stoller, thank you for stopping by the show today. I definitely
My
appreciate
pleasure.
Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House, and The Imperfect Storm, From Henry Street to Hollywood. Those are some books on Amazon. And if they'd like, they can go to stevestoller.com/books, right?
Slash shop, I think.
Shop. Okay.
Yes. And I'd be happy to sign. Well, this was a pleasure.
Yes, I definitely appreciate you stopping by. You had so much to talk about, and you know what? There's so much more of Hollywood that you.
Well, I made it all up.
Well, you did a good job. Yeah, stevestoller.com/shop, and then there's also on Amazon, and we'll have the links on TVHams.com for this. So definitely everything about you can find out just from just going there. But I appreciate it. Thank you very much, sir.
My pleasure.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, thanks. All right, this is Gentleman Grachowski Show. Thanks for watching.